Ooh, ooh, ooh. Okay, for our Halloween special, we are going to be doing a second video on Egyptian mummies. In the first video, we talked about the mummification procedure in general. In this video, we are going to discuss 10 things you might not know about mummies on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. This is our second special on mummies. And in this video, we are going to talk about 10 facts you might not know about mummies. Fact number 1. The pinnacle of the art of mummy making was in the Third Intermediate Period. Now, it is often thought that the New Kingdom was the pinnacle of mummy making. This perception likely formed because of the discovery of the fabulous burial of King Tut. However, the art of mummy making continued to develop into the Third Intermediate Period. And it is during the Third Intermediate Period that ancient Egyptians developed several innovations and refinements in the process of mummy making. The mummy makers of the 21st dynasty made prosthetics for mummies that had lost limbs so that the dead souls could enter the afterlife with complete bodies. They also filled the body cavities of the mummies with sawdust to make the bodies look fuller. They also added fake gemstone eyes, they added wigs, and they covered the bodies with gold foil to ritually transform their forms for the afterlife. The Third Intermediate Period mummy makers strove to make the body of the deceased a godlike work of art that went beyond simply how the outside wrappings were decorated. Number 2. The brain of the mummies was often not removed. Now, we have mentioned this one in a short video, but it bears repeating. It used to be thought that mummy makers would put a tool up the nose of the deceased, scramble the brain, and drain out the brain cavity. Much of this was based upon the fact that early archaeologists would cut open skulls of the mummies and found that the skulls were empty. However, recent studies using CT scanning have shown that the brain was not drained or removed, but that the brain was desiccated by the mummification process. And this process turns the brain into a film that adheres to the side of the skull. Now, what remains of the brain, this film, is visible in CT scans, but it's really easy to miss during an autopsy. Number 3. The skin on mummies is darker than it was in real life. After about 36 hours, once the person dies, the skin color on a cadaver begins to change in a process called marbling. Marbling is when the skin on the body starts to turn a greenish black color. As a result of marbling, the skin on a mummy will always appear darker than it had been when the person was alive. So, if you see a mummy, that person's skin was probably lighter color when the person was alive. Number 4. The bodies of the dead are mummified for 40 days, followed by 30 days of mourning. The narrative in Genesis 50, verse 3, mentions that the Egyptians mummified Jacob for 40 days, and the entire mourning process was 70 days. Egyptian sources show that this was pretty much the normative time of mummification. The body was washed, packed in natron, and salted in natron for up to 40 days. At the end of 40 days, the salting process was stopped, regardless of the state of the body. Then the body was wrapped, and then for another 30 days, there was this sort of quiet process of mourning. Now, when I mean quiet, I mean people would hire professional mourners to cry and scream out and all that, and they were paid for this job. And then at the end of that 30 days, the body was actually buried. Number 5. The mummification process didn't always stop the body from rotting. Sometimes, 40 days of salting wasn't enough to arrest decomposition. Some mummies continued to decay after the body was wrapped. For example, the body of King Tut shows evidence of post-mortem decay. Now, this problem was known to the Egyptians. Such decomposition was attributed as damage caused by the god Seth, who fed on the decay of dead bodies. However, this problem didn't cause the Egyptians to change their mummification process. They just had a religious explanation for why it happened. Number 6. The organs of the deceased were removed and placed in canopic jars to prevent the mummy from rotting. After the body was washed, the liver, heart, lungs, and intestines were all removed from the body cavity and placed in 4 canopic jars. And the reason this was done is because if you did not remove the internal organs from the body cavity, they would start to decay inside the body and cause the rest of the mummy to rot away. So, it was necessary to remove the internal organs. And unlike, say, the body itself, which was preserved in natron, there doesn't seem to have been any efforts placed upon preserving the organs. They were simply put in these 4 jars and, to the best of our knowledge, just simply allowed to rot in the canopic jars. Number 7. Very important people, for example kings, had their mummies encased in a mix of bitumen and plaster. Now, this was an anti-robbing measure. It was found in the tomb of King Tut, as well as some second intermediate period royal burials at Abydos. And how this works is that tar, that also called bitumen, that was imported from the Levant, was heated up and mixed with plaster. And this concoction was poured over the mummy inside the sarcophagus. And the sarcophagus was quite literally filled with this stuff. When the mixture cooled, it formed a black, waxy substance that encased the mummy and was quite difficult to remove. Howard Carter spent 8 months removing this gunk from the mummy of King Tut using swabs soaked in acetone. Now, on a side note, this same mixture is used today as a support base for the chasing blocks used by silversmiths. So, it's actually some really useful stuff. Number 8. Mummies were considered to be ritually pure. Unlike the ancient Israelites, who thought that the bodies of the dead were ritually unclean, the Egyptians viewed the mummies as ritually pure. By the time the Egyptians were done preparing the bodies for burial, there was little risk of contracting anything nasty from the cadaver. The texture of mummies was like beef jerky, and the bodies could be handled with no problem of defilement or disease. Number 9. Mummies only weigh about 5 pounds without the wrappings. A fully wrapped mummy weighs about 68 pounds, but most of that weight is composed of linens, adhesives, plasters and paints that are used to sort of hold all the mummy wrappings together. The actual bones and flesh of the body itself weigh between generally 5 and 8 pounds. After a mummy is wrapped, it is covered with plaster, and then that plaster is decorated with spells, metal foils, and just these phenomenal images, particularly of goddesses that were served to protect the dead in their voyage to the afterlife. Now, when I took my osteology class, we would reassemble skeletons that were stored in what looked like these large shoe boxes. One of the most surprising things that I discovered when doing osteology, and osteology is the study of skeletons and what it is. You know, you'd pick up one of these shoe boxes and they were incredibly light. I mean, 5 pounds is not an unreasonable weight for any skeleton recovered from an archaeological dig. They're incredibly light. You would not think that they were that light, but most of your weight is water. So once skeletons have been dehydrated, all the moisture is out of the flesh and the bones, there's really not much to them. So they are incredibly light. And finally, number 10. Mummies are very fragile. Now, in a museum setting, care must be taken when handling mummies. They are light, but are also easily damaged. They are incredibly susceptible to shock and water damage. A hard knock could make the insides of a mummy break apart and all fall to the feet of the mummy, causing the mummy to sag like a deflated balloon. Likewise, water damage will cause mummified flesh to dissolve so that all that remains is a pile of bones. Is it supposed to be gooey? No. Okay? But that's what happens when a mummy gets wet. All the flesh just dissolves. Now, the moral of the story is that mummies are the lamest movie monsters. They're light and they're fragile. They're essentially less threatening than a house cat. Oh, very scary. Oh. So, there you have it. 10 things you might not have known about mummies. We hope you found this video interesting and entertaining. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.